collection. Morning, girls. They are just too tiny. Girl, still listed as negative, but it said. Good morning and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. So you may recognize where we are, but it looks a little bit different. This is kind of like the alleyway that we normally walk on our way to the greenhouse during things like the garden tour or whatever. But I've got it blocked off because recently we experienced where basically all of our bucks and meat goats, save for just a couple, were very, very anemic. And I didn't even know that they were sick until I got my hands on them for our annual disease test, which did come back negative. Everything was negative and we're really grateful for that. There was one little thing about that, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but when we did our disease test, we did their feet and we checked their FOMACHA score, which is their anemia score. You can tell how anemic they may or may not be based on the color of the inside of their eyelid, and many of these boys had a completely white score, which is not good. So I decided to treat many of them both for coccidia and for worms, and then we moved them into a spot that really hasn't had goats on it very much at all. Up here this hasn't had goats in at least a year, just to help get them on some fresh ground. Now when you do that, you want to make sure that you do have what's called refugia. So you don't ever want to deworm a whole herd of goats and then move the whole herd to a new pasture, because no dewormer is 100% effective. So they are still going to be pooping out some worm eggs, and those worm eggs are of worms that didn't die even with your treatments. And so those are resistant worms, and you don't really want to seed a fresh pasture with those resistant worms only. So there are actually quite a few goats out here that were not dewormed. This one, Mochi, was not, and then there's one back there that have not had the dewormer. This, I don't think Mochi's ever had one. And so with that, we know that there's a measure of refugia. There is a mix of worm eggs entering the pasture. Some of them are resistant worms, but some of them are not, so that we don't just seed the pasture with resistant worms. That would be a bad idea. These guys have only been out here for maybe 18 hours at this point, and they've taken down the grass level by about 2 feet, which is really awesome. It was super tall. It was about as tall as this post is here. Look at that full rumen. Hang on, let me come in there. I'll come in there. We've been begging for rain for over a month and haven't gotten it, so we're turning pretty brown. We did get a sprinkle of rain this weekend, but it genuinely was not enough to even pretend to soak the ground. It was probably only as wet as our normal morning dew. Good morning, Clover. Good morning, Talia. I recently posted a really funny photo of these guys eating, and Talia's udder was just sitting on top of Mooch, and it was so funny. And in the comment section of that photo, there was a great question posed. Someone asked, is he even going to be able to reach when it comes to breeding time, when these girls do come into heat? And the answer is no. I'm pretty sure that Clover was in heat when I took the garden tour this past week, and there was never any evidence of breeding. Now, that was their first heat cycle together. They've only been together for a little bit less than 2 weeks, and so they're still kind of getting acquainted, and sometimes that can happen. But I don't think that even if they were pretty well acquainted that he could reach at all. So the answer is he's just gonna need a booster. So the plan for me is to keep a close eye on them. And then when I notice one of the girls in heat, what I'll literally do is just dump out their water trough and turn that over to give him a little bit of a boost, and he'll be able to reach. That's what I've done before when we've bred for mini La Manchas. So as far as our breeding plan goes, these are the only 2 girls that Mooch is going to have this fall for spring breeding. We have Talia and Clover. And right next to their pen, you can see that we've set up some of our electric netting. So over here, where our bees are, is somewhere that goats have never been. So we've attached the fence to the stationary fence back there, the woven wire, and have brought it all the way around the greenhouse. And then we've attached it again right there. So here's the full collection of boys that have access to this area now. And I'll show you how far out it goes. It's pretty extensive, so they've got a lot to munch on. And those of you that have been on the channel before recognize this one here. This is Havoc. He's a buck that we have used for many years. Farrell doesn't have access to this area yet, but he will. He's running from me because that's what Havoc does. But when we did our disease testing and we banded some other boys, we did band Havoc as well. And that is simply because we're done with Havoc. And that's kind of sad because we've been using him for about 3 seasons now. We've gotten a lot of daughters out of him, and our herd is just time for us to get a new herd sire, and we've gotten them already. We have Mooch, we have Nefarious, and we have Farrell, who's acting quite bucky, and there's just no more need for Havoc. I did offer him as a herd sire to some of the locals here, but there were no takers, and part of that is that Havoc is hard to handle. You really need, honestly, more than 2 adults to be able to get a hold of him. Recently, I've determined that what I would like to do as far as breeding bucks go is only put out there what I would be willing to use myself. And we did enter some girls into the MDGA virtual show, and I'll talk about those results in just a second. But it didn't necessarily take the show and those judges' opinions in order to see that the udders that Havoc puts out, they are good. They're soft, they put out a lot of milk, but they just lack a lot of attachment. So the udders are pretty low hanging. They don't really hold up nice and tight to the body. And honestly, those are not udders that I really want to perpetuate in my herd. So if that's not something that I'd be willing to use in order to get more of in my herd, it's not something that I'm willing to pass on into other herds either, because we do have better options here to offer the community. So we have banded Havoc, and he is one of our freezer goats for this fall. We can probably get pretty close to Jupiter so you can see they were banded about 8 days ago, 8 or 9 days ago, and things are pretty darn shriveled up, and that's obviously the goal. So ultimately what I would like to do is put Farrell out here with his many girlfriends, because he has a lot of does that he's breeding this year, and really I'd like to give them the maximum amount of space. So we have our wethers out here right now because they really needed to get onto some greener pastures. I had started feeding hay because we haven't gotten a lot of rain, and I was needing to mow in here, and that just seemed kind of stupid to feed hay and mow. I might as well let the goats eat the grass. So the wethers are out here for now, but I don't really want to introduce the girls until the boys have had a chance to dry up for about 2 weeks. I follow another goat breeder on here. I don't know his name, but it's packgoats.com, and he has a lot of really great content that isn't all like relevant to me because I don't raise pack goats, but he does eat goat meat like we do, and he has a lot of very similar practices to what we use. And when he bands his older boys, he'll actually cut off kind of the dry parts after about 2 weeks, and in theory at that point there's nothing being produced. So I'll feel safe putting our does out here at that point, which is in about 5 days. Lots of forage opportunities that are good and tall. They haven't made it out here because the other side where they are at right now is pretty new to all of them. And then they've got access to all of this over here. So it is a good amount of space for all these goats. I just noticed the pumpkin patch was open. They haven't made their way down here, and they really haven't been eating the pumpkin leaves, as evidenced by this right here. Big pumpkin out in the goat pasture. Here's another one. This one's starting to turn color. Good morning, girls. How goes it? Hi. Good morning, Winnie. Good morning. All right, so as far as Farrell's girlfriends, the girls that will be going back into that new area that we just established, we have Tori and literally all of the other mini La Manchas. So Shindy and Fury, Tizzy, Breezy, Elara, and actually Elpis is going to be given to Farrell this fall too. So that is 7 girlfriends for Farrell. What we really want out of Feral is does, and so I think our chances are good. Feral is actually almost 70% La Mancha, so combining him with Elpis will result in a goat that is 90% La Mancha. Still technically a mini because there is Nigerian influence, but obviously with 90% La Mancha, it's a bigger mini. Speaking of big minis, Alara's huge. I don't normally like to breed my minis until they're about 80 pounds. And usually that's a little bit hard to achieve in their first year or for their first fall. But Talia, who is Alara's mom and Breezy's mom, she makes big babies. And so both of these were ready in their first year. Actually, last year, Breezy was the only mini La Mancha that I was able to breed because of her size. And she did really well. She had twin bucklings for us earlier in the year. She does have that Havoc udder. It's a little bit low hanging. It's very productive as far as milk goes. It's very, very soft. But when udders hang low, they just don't have the real possibility for a lot of longevity. They can just cause problems. I have seen where does that are born out of the same two parents the same year can have vastly different udder structures. Actually, Clover, she is the Chemosé that's out with our buck Mooch. She was a triplet doe, and I happen to have had her sister here, and my mentor has her other sister, and I have seen all three udders, and Clover really has the best udder. It's sucked up real high. She has a nice rear udder height. The teat placement is nice. And so even though we do have a lot of Havoc daughters here, different things can happen even with the same genetics. So we have Shindy, Tizzy, and Fury are all out of Elpis through Havoc. They could all have very different udders. Margie Moo's leading the herd out to pasture. We're gonna go get some grub. So I did tell you that we have 3 bucks that we're using right now. We have Mooch, we have Feral, and we do have Nefarious. Nefarious is only getting 1 girlfriend this fall. He's our smallest buck. He's going to be paired with our largest doe. This is Elsa. Elsa has a big old pretty udder that is not in its prime right now. It's been a while since she kidded, and I've only been milking her once a day. So we don't have full capacity, but she looks good. And her boyfriend is definitely going to need a booster. What I'm doing with her is literally just waiting until I see her in heat. I'll put her in the milking parlor. I'll bring in Nefarious. The milk stand can be his booster, and he'll get it done. When you wait to see heats like this and only introduce them when you notice the doe is in heat and you kind of monitor the breeding, it's called hand breeding. That's really what is required for us to breed our La Manchas to our Nigerians. Now Havoc, who we've used in the past, he has really long legs, and so he is actually able to reach a standard La Mancha, but the boys that I have right now are a lot shorter. They are a lot more like show standard. They can only be, I think it's 22 inches high. Havoc may actually be too tall in order to show, but he was tall enough to breed, which worked well. But like I said, we just don't have any more use for him here. So the MDGA virtual show, how did that go? It went actually better than I expected. So we were actually taking part in 3 different classes. I entered 6 or 7 goats. I can't exactly remember, but I do know that Breezy, because she's in milk, she was in a different class than my junior does that are not in milk, that are her same age, because they didn't have a developed udder. Breezy, I sort of knew, because udder is a very big part of the scorecard. She came in last, and I knew that that would happen, but what I was looking for was the judge's critique on the rest of her, so that I could just sort of get like a status report on what's going right in my herd and focus on that, and get a critique on what maybe isn't going so right in my herd, and I can also work on that. So Breezy came in last in her class, but she did get some really great remarks about her capacity as far as her willingness to milk, and she also got some really great remarks about her bones. And honestly, that was the praise that our does got across the board, was how long their bones were, their bone structure, their length of body. So I know where my does really have their strengths, and then I can work on their weaknesses and kind of balance things out. Miss Tori here, she did pretty good. Now I feel like because it was my first show, my first time trying to take good pictures of my goats, that I probably didn't do all of them justice with my placement of my camera or placing their feet. But Tori did pretty good, yeah. I can't wait to see Tori freshen and get that udder on. I think out of all of the does that I submitted into the show, Shindy did the best. She got the best remarks. She placed 5th, I think, out of 13 in her class, and that's pretty darn good. Again, she got compliments on her bones, on her length of leg, on her length of neck. So I know that we have some nice starter goats for our mini La Mancha program. So I'm only breeding 10 goats this fall to kid in springtime. Some of my Nigerian dwarves, I'm holding off to breed them in the summer. They're just a little small this year. Both of these two, Winnie and Foxy, are just too tiny for me to breed them. And so we'll wait until next year. Honestly, I like to breed my Nigerian dwarves in the summer or late spring so that they can kid in the fall, so that I can have a good continuous supply of milk. I always want to be in fresh milk, and it is also nice to kid a couple times a year because we do keep back a lot of goats for meat, but we also sell some, and so having like a periodical income stream with the sale of the babies is also helpful. And when it comes to dry off our bigger does towards the end of their pregnancy, I have milk that can take their place in the refrigerator. So as far as fall kidders here are our 2. They are due in about a month. So September 27th for Margie. She was bred to feral and she is due with mini La Manchas. She's getting really big. Look at her. Good gracious, mama. And then Stormy here. She's bred to Nefarious, so she's gonna have purebred Nigerian dwarves, and she is out of Havoc, but I really like her udder and how it's starting to develop. I can see that she's got a little bit more attachment and a little bit more height than we're used to seeing out of Havoc's udders, and that's a really good thing. That's what we're looking for. I do have Stormy's full sister right next to me. This is Tempest. She's a year older than Stormy. Her udder, I like it. It's one of my favorite Nigerian udders, but it could use some work as far as height and attachment. I think her sister might have a better udder than her, which kind of helps me out with my culls later on. Because if I have 2 does that are genetically identical and I'm looking for a little bit of diversity, if one is better than the other, especially in the udder department, it makes it easier to make those decisions. We don't necessarily breed for, you know, show ready animals here, but we really do want to kind of stick as well as we can to those show standards because they're there for a reason. They're not just there for producing a pretty goat. Those standards are there so you can have a guide to produce strong, healthy animals that have a long and productive life. I have been asked before, actually pretty recently, about how we decide which animals go into the freezer. And a lot of times I will know that an animal is going to go in the freezer before they're even born. Like in the case of Elpis, I'm breeding her to feral simply so I can get big goats. Big goats is more meat in the freezer. I don't really like Elpis's udder. I've gotten a lot of compliments on her udder from show people, but as far as milkability goes, her udder is just terrible for that. So while keeping that same standard that I'd like to have for myself of only selling bucks from does that I would retain bucks out of myself and use in my own program, I will be putting bucklings out of her in the freezer. And I know that ahead of time as she has not even been bred yet. I'm really hoping that Feral will be able to make improvements on her udder, so it's very likely that I'll keep does out of her just to check up on that. Oh, Feisty, there's enough grass for everyone. Girls. And in the case of Margie down here, Margie's actually my heart goat. I love Margie way more than she loves me. She's actually a little bit standoffish. She's a lot more friendly when she's in labor. And I can get up to her, I can handle her and things. She's just not a pocket goat. She's huge, look at her. But Margie's udder has a lot to be desired. She does have a high capacity. She puts a lot in the pail, but it sits very low. It's what's called a swing udder, where there's basically nothing holding it to her body. Her ligaments are just very poor in the back. And also Margie, I can tell when she starts putting milk in the pail, when I start putting her milk in with all of the other milks, and that is because it thins it out a lot. Margie is part Alpine. Alpines are not necessarily known for their butterfat content. I'm sure there are excellent Alpines out there, but they're just not one of the breeds that's well known for a lot of butterfat, and she really missed the butterfat train. And so Feral actually has a really nice casein content to the milk that his lineage produces. And so we know he's going to improve the quality of milk from this line as well as the udders. So I'm really hoping for daughters out of her. Likewise though, I will not be selling bucks out of Margie. Those are going to be freezer bucks. I know that eating goat is a strange concept for a lot of people, but if you think about it, it's the exact same thing that people who keep dairy cows do. A lot of people will keep back a steer from their dairy cow and raise it up for meat and take it to the processor. And a lot of people don't blink an eye at that, but this is the exact same thing. One of the benefits though is that goats are small enough to where we can process them here, and I don't need to spend the money to take them to a processor and figure out that whole process out. And it's a really great way to be able to use surplus bucklings because there's only so many pets that can be sold. I know right now, especially since the environment from COVID has died down a lot, it's hard to sell a buckling for what they're worth. And so to be able to put them in the freezer in order to relieve the pressure on our pastures and not just have a whole bunch of, you know, pasture princes out here, it's a really great option. And goat meat is incredibly delicious. It is a lot like if you combined lamb with pork. I really enjoy the fat, the tallow that is on goat's meat. It's a lot like pork fat. It's very buttery and melty and very, very good. I think goat is a very underappreciated meat out there, to be honest. It's something that is very approachable and very doable on small scale for a lot of homesteaders if they could just get past like the concept of eating goat. We also eat a ton of rabbit, and that's something that could be a little bit of a block for a lot of people. But goat and rabbit are actually eaten quite regularly worldwide. It's just us Americans are not used to it. Coming back. So a little earlier I talked to you about our disease test and how everybody came back negative for all the things. In our herd, we do the full disease panel. I want to be able to say that we are disease-free across the board. So we test for Yonis, we test for CAE, and we test for CL. Now a lot of people will omit the CL test because they say that there's a lot of false positives on there. Apparently there's a bunch of factors that can contribute to them throwing a false positive, to include having been vaccinated for CL. We do not vaccinate at all here in our herd, so that is not a possibility. But we did have one goat, Miss Breezy here, she's over at the water trough, who was still listed as negative per the lab, but it said retest in 2 to 6 months for CL. And so I was talking to my mentor and a couple other goat people, and they said that it's probably nothing. For whatever reason, her levels of antibody in her body were a little bit elevated, not elevated enough to create a suspect reading or a positive reading, but just a little bit on the upper end of normal. And so they're going to want to check her in the future. I've been wondering if Elsa's coming into heat. She might be. I need to watch her. Yeah. Yeah, do I need to get your boyfriend in here today? I mean, we could try it. Also, stress can make their antibody levels fluctuate. And so my mentor said, well, make sure she's not getting beat up, make sure she doesn't have a heavy worm load, and think of other ways that, other things that might have stressed her out in the last little bit. And to be honest, Breezy's super mellow. Like, she never gets into fights. She's really, really chill. And so I just could not think of what it could be. And then I remembered. So I was down here in the barn a few weeks ago, and Breezy just came tearing out of the barn, shaking her head with wasps following behind her. So I have actually sprayed this nest, but I don't know, it's pretty extensive back in this wall. I'm not gonna get super close to it because I don't want them coming after me, but there's a wasp nest right here down by the mineral trays. So you can tell that the mineral trays are dirty and I have not filled them up. That's because I don't really want to get close to these mineral trays, and I don't want the goats to get closer to that than they have to. They do have loose mineral over here, which is far away from the wasps, but she got stung that day to where she wasn't wanting me to touch her, she wasn't wanting me to pet her. It was pretty rough, and if injections can affect their antibody levels, I mean, why not a wasp sting? I don't know. Normally the lab will call you back and ask you if you have any questions about your results. So when they do call me back, if they don't call me back, I'll probably call them and see what they think. Sorry about the change of scenery. My camera got too hot while we were outside. Breezy was born here, out of Talia. Last year, all of my goats tested negative, to include Breezy. This year, all of my goats tested negative. Breezy may be on the upper end of negative, but really, where would she have gotten CL from if she comes from a tested negative herd and she's never left it? Now, I have had one person in my goat barn. It's my friend Megan, and her herd recently tested negative. CL can be passed through flies. So let's say my neighbor's cow has an abscess that burst and a fly was messing with that abscess and then came and got into like Breezy's eye or something. I think that that is the only slim possibility for her to have been exposed to CL. And even if this is kind of like a false warning or whatever, it's kind of nice to know that for whatever reason her immune system is working on something. I do have that wasp sting that she got in really the forefront of my mind, but if she hadn't gotten stung or I hadn't seen her get stung, I would wonder, okay, what's going on with Breezy that's making her immune system work a little bit harder than it has to? It gets my eyes on her in a way that I might not normally have looked closely at her. So I appreciate it nonetheless. I will be retesting her in 2 to 6 months because she technically tests negative. I am still going to put her in my regular breeding rotation, so she will be joining feral in the big pen coming up really soon. So the fall breeding is starting, but fall kidding is a very, very close behind. And if you've got kidding fever, I have been able to attend a lot of our goat births here on our homestead. So here's our most recent playlist. And if you're curious about goat's meat and maybe how it compares to something like deer, like venison, I have this video here too.